2. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to have you here today. And let me just say that this is a speaker that I always look forward to having on our webinar series. Our most popular, most requested topic of conversation. I've had more emails, voicemails, phone calls this morning about what time was this webinar going to start? Are we going to get a copy of the recording? Because this is a must-see in your practice growth and figuring out what is your exit plan going to be, because, I mean, we all want to retire someday, right? And who better than to have talk about this than my good friend, Dr. Tom Necela. I am so excited to have him here because he is the expert, which is why we bring him on here at least twice a year to cover this topic of conversation. If you don't know who he is, I don't know where you have been. He is a speaker. He travels all over the U.S. talking. You're going to see more and more of him as we go into 2019. He's written articles, has an amazing blog. If you are not following the Strategic Chiropractor and looking at their blog on a regular basis, you should be, because this information is must-have. At the top of the hour, he's reporting on everything, making things clear and concise so that you, the doctor, and your staff can understand it. Now, I'm going to quit gushing about Dr. Tom because I could talk about him for the whole hour, but I'm going to shut up, turn it over to him, and let him take over from here, because here he is who we really want to hear from today. So, Dr. Tom, it's all yours.
Well, thanks so much, Christy, and I'm going to have you talk to my children someday and gush about me to them, because it might be a little different there. So anyway, thanks to all of you for coming out today to What is My Chiropractic Practice Worth? And we're going to be talking about establishing a fair market value for either your practice sale or a transition. And I'll just define that one right from the start. Transition might mean you want to slow down and figure out how you're going to eventually get out. A transition might be you want to sell in time to an associate or anything like that. So this is, as Christy said, essential information for everybody at some point in time. And really, this is a little bit of the other hat that I like to wear here at Strategic Chiropractor, because we first got hooked up with ChiroHealthUSA because I speak, as Christy said, a lot on billing, coding, compliance, documentation, that kind of thing. But then what happened is over the last 10 years or so, my clients started getting old. And you might be in that role, or maybe you're just forward thinking and you say, I want to figure out what I do at the end. And they start saying, hey, how can we get out? What do we do to get out of here? And so really, that's what we're going to be talking about today, and establishing this fair market value for your practice sale or your transition. And the first thing that I just have to ask all of you is kind of, what have you heard? Do you have any ideas of what your practice is worth? And so let's do something fun. Use the questions tab, the questions panel there, and let me know what you think your practice is worth, either through what you heard through the grapevine, that would be called a guess, and put a G in a number, or if you've actually had some sort of a appraisal or evaluation, then put an A in that number. And if you've got no clue, then just go ahead and put an N for no clue. So again, give me your best guess with a G. If you have an appraisal or evaluation, give me a number there in terms of A. And if you have no idea, then go ahead and type in the questions panel N for no clue. And then that will just let me know where you're all at, so that we can make this the most relevant and appropriate webinar for you and where you stand. Okay? And here's the other thing. Certainly not going to embarrass anybody or call anybody out by last name or anything here. Everyone is anonymous, so don't worry. I know that practice sales and transitions are also extremely confidential. So everybody is going to be a first name person here, and since we have lots of people from all over the country. Nobody's going to figure out who it is. So we are getting some N's, no clues coming through. We got a G of 1 year gross sales. And earning times in X, but nobody indicates what the X is. We've got a couple of those, earning times this. Yearly collection, no clue. Let's see. So we've getting answers from Dr. Linda, Mike, William, Patrick, no clue. Ross, no clue. Dennis, no clue. Jay, no clue. Jack, no clue. Brock, no clue. Brian, no clue. Peggy, no clue. Let's see. Amanda actually has an A there, and Mark and Susan, no clue. So let's just stop because all of you guys, hey, thanks for participating. I think the no clues win. And then I think second place is we have a few guesses. And then I only saw really two come through on an appraisal. Okay, so that means most of you are either in the very beginning stages or you're here to discover, and that's really what we're going to be talking about. And in that respect, I can wind the clock back over 10 years ago and was right in your shoes. And my story is that I had a strong practice, but I suddenly found myself in a very weak position physically in that I was deteriorating health-wise and extremely noticed that my business, even though it was strong, was extremely dependent on me. I also had no clue what my practice is worth, and so I did the only thing that I knew, which was to talk with my wife about selling it, and went and started looking into what a practice was worth. And my big problem was I was in my 30s at the time, and what they said the appraisal came out for, the valuation wasn't going to get me enough money for the rest of my life. And some of you might be in your 30s, your 40s, your 50s, and that might be the case. Some of you might be in your 60s, and that's going to be the case. So really, then that led me on a hunt to say, okay, so if the traditional sale, as I call it, sell and walk away, wasn't going to work, well, how do people get out? And that's where I discovered we're a little different in chiropractic. In fact, when I started talking to dentists, friends of mine and older dentists and mentors that I had in dentistry field, when I started talking to medical doctors and attorneys and accountants, I discovered that virtually every other profession actually transitions way differently than chiropractors. Because when I dove in deeper, the traditional chiropractic sale really looked like this. You sold your practice for a fraction of what it was worth at the end of your career after you let it kind of go down and in the toilet. And what I found was that was probably what more than 80% of the chiropractors did. And of course, that means they got very little for the practice. When I looked into dentistry, they laughed at that idea. And I looked over and I said, well, you guys bring in associates and you have these group practices, and so do medical doctors. And the dentist or the medical doctor was kind of retiring slowly over time, and I looked into law and accounting, and they're developing partnerships where they have junior and senior partners and people buying in little different pieces and portions, and realized, wow, there are a lot more options out there than I realized as a chiropractor, and a lot more options than most chiropractors ever take advantage of. And so because the traditional sale wasn't going to work for me, I did what I call a non-traditional transition and looked into some of these other options to where I could actually sell my practice but create additional income streams, which eventually led to what I'm doing now, which is absolutely loving life after practice. This is what I call my second act, and there might be some of you who are in that same phase, or maybe some of you aren't really retirement age and you say, I'm just tired of chiropractic, or I want to do something else, or I want to slow down. But if your only option that you believe is there's only one way to get out, that might not work. So that's why we're going to talk about the value And I absolutely believe that I'm not special in the way that I got out. I was just desperate. And because of my health issues, I researched this. So I would say, hey, why can't you do this? Well, I'm going to answer that problem for you, at least the first part of it, because the first problem that I incurred that you will incur is you can't decide which option is best for you if you don't know what your practice is worth. So, if you say, hey, I could get out A, B, or C, A will probably get me this much money, B gives me the potential for this money, and C can give me this much potential. Well, they all imply that you have an idea of what the practice is worth. So that's where we're going on this webinar. And to figure that out, we're going to discuss what I call the 4 prerequisites, 4 things you need to understand about your practice, your business, and how its value is tied in before you can actually then figure out what it's worth. And the first is to understand the components of the value. So the funny thing is, when I asked, and I do this webinar a lot into a lot of different audiences, and they all come in with the same type of answers that you give, which is a lot of people with not really any clue. And even if they give a clue about how a practice is valued, like a formula, the formulas all differ. Well, here's why. It's not one formula. It's not one component. There's not one set, easy, hey, do this times this and you get this. So there are multiple components. So let's just see kind of, if you're even aware of that, what are the 5 primary value factors? In other words, what goes into the price that you can ask for your practice or what your practice is worth? Go ahead and play along, type in the questions box, and see if you can name one of them. Okay, I don't think anybody will nail all 5, maybe, but see if you can name one. Type that into the question box. One of the 5 primary value factors. We'll put them all together, and we'll be able to understand how your practice is worth what it's worth. Okay, so yeah, go ahead and use the question panel. Type that in. What are the 5 primary value factors? At least name one. All right, so let's go through and see if any answers coming in. Average annual revenue, says Dr. Amanda. Years in business, says Dr. Mike. All right, AR, says Dr. J. Longevity, and says Dr. Linda. We'll equate that to, years in practice, years in business, years at that location. Collections, overhead, equipment, says Dr. Ross. Dr. Kevin says annual receipts. Dr. Peggy says gross receipts, net income. All right, so here's the cool thing. You guys are right on track. So I've got a real smart audience here today, and this is great because I think you named 4 out of the 5, which is great. So here are the 5 primary value factors. And the reason I say primary is some of you named some things that do go into the value, but I would consider them secondary. In other words, they're not going to be calculated into some sort of formula, into some sort of multiple or valuation method, but they do influence the attractiveness of your practice. So we're going to talk about 5 primary, though. These numbers literally get factored in, okay? So the first is what we call goodwill. That is actually the majority of what you are selling as a chiropractor. So really, the goodwill can easily be defined as this. You're selling to a prospective buyer or to your associate or anyone interested in your transition plan the fact that these patients that are coming to see you now will come to see you, Mr. or Dr. prospective buyer, when and after I transition or sell. Okay, so goodwill is simply the patients that you're seeing now are going to see the new doc, and that's a big bulk of what you sell. And you say, well, how is that a number? Well, goodwill is also a factor of what's the practice doing. In other words, what is it collecting now? Because you could say, look, we collected, in fact, I talked to a very clueless doc recently. He said, hey, I collected $700,000, nice practice. I'd love to sell it for $1.2 million. And the problem with that is he's never done $1.2 million. So in other words, he's trying to sell more goodwill than he really has. So goodwill is translated again into the ability to have your patients see this new buyer, and it's a factor of the collections that you currently are doing in your practice. And we'll get a little more detailed in a moment. The second primary value factor that may contribute, and the reason we use may is actually for this one, the accounts receivable. And in essence, accounts receivable does not have to be factored into your practice price and is not a component of every valuation method. But if accounts receivable is transferred with the practice sale, it has value. And what value does it have? Well, we're owed this money by all these patients, and if you stand here and collect it, then you should get a reasonable percentage or amount of this money. Now, I can spoil the surprise for all of you, and if you have $100,000 of accounts receivable, the bad news is it's not worth $100,000 because, as you well know, you're not likely to collect $100,000. And the value of your accounts receivable is somewhat proportionate to your ability to collect it and obviously then to your buyer's ability to collect it. The third value factor that we have that contributes is your equipment. And herein, some of you have very lean and mean equipment set up, and some of you have a ton of equipment. So obviously, they both affect the overall value of the practice because the new buyer is going to be purchasing the equipment with the practice in most cases. The non-compete agreement has value because if the buyer purchases the practice in your town, he or she does not want you to say, well, I'm not really ready to retire. I'll sell you this practice, move across the street. A good portion of those patients will follow me and I'll have my next job already lined up. They wouldn't like that. And so therefore, there is value to the ability to have a non-compete agreement for them to assure or ensure that what they're buying is what they'll be getting. And then the fifth factor that, again, may contribute is your building. Now, again, you may not either own the building, in which case it won't contribute any value. You may not choose to sell the building. And at that case, then it won't be valued into the price of your practice either. But the building can add value. And here's the other thing. Even if you're leasing a building, you don't own it, it definitely adds what I call the attractor factor. So if you're in a great space, great location, that kind of thing, then it becomes more attractive. It might not get written down into a formula, but it helps. Okay? So those are the 5 primary value factors that may contribute to how value is attached to your practice. That's the first thing that we have to understand. It's not just one formula, one figure. The second thing that we have to understand is actually what fair market value means. And fair market value is very, very simple in its definition. It's essentially the value that a willing buyer and a willing seller agree to. Now, there's one little catch to this in that when you go to sell your practice, the majority of practice sales, or at least in my experience, the majority of owners want their practice sale to also be financed. So the fair market value is actually established between the buyer and the seller. And let's say, for example, you both agree the practice is worth $500,000. And then you tell your buyer, well, yeah, go to a bank, get a loan, and buy this thing from me. And they go to the bank, and the bank does their own appraisal, and they say, we'll lend $400,000. Now, on the surface, you might say, no, wait a minute. They said my practice is only worth $400,000. And actually, they didn't. They said, we'll lend $400,000. And if your buyer has another $100,000 in their pocket or ability to do it, then guess what? You got your $500,000. But the challenge with fair market value is that there are 3 players now. And 2 of them agreed on the value, and we have to also make it work practically for the financing. So we need to understand that, because sometimes people will hear a number and say, that sounds great. But in reality, it also needs to be paid for or financed by someone. Okay? All right. So then the next factor is what we call market perception. In other words, what does the market say about what chiropractic practices are valued? We could also call this the word on the street. Now, just like rumors, stereotypes, or other things like that, it doesn't mean it's the most accurate perception. It just means this is what people are thinking. So I'd love to know from you all, what have you heard in terms of if we had to have a percentage or something like that? And let's just say this. If we say the market perception is this, you fill in the blank for me. A chiropractic practice is worth this percent of the yearly collections. Give me the percent that you've heard. A chiropractic practice is worth this percent of the yearly collections. Go ahead and give that to me. Type it in the questions box. Let's see what you have heard about what the market says. And again, we're going to just acknowledge that this is not a hard and fast evaluation method, but it's another factor that you're going to come up against when establishing the fair market value for your practice. All right. So we've got Dr. Kevin that says 100%. We've got Dr. Ross says 75%. We've got a few question marks, 65%, 60%. Okay, so here's the cool thing. You're all in the ballpark. And this is one of those things where you say, well, who's making up the ballpark? Well, this is part of the challenge with it being a market perception. So there are chiropractic school professors, teachers at chiropractic schools that say this is what a practice is worth. And here's why they say that. That's what they got for their practice when they sold and they decided to go into teaching. Or that's what they heard their friend got in. Or you'll have a practice broker that says this is how you figure out this is the value because that's going to get them in the ballpark in a quick figure so somebody can figure out, hey, do I actually want to sell or not? Again, these are all perceptions, and perception is not always reality. But by and large, what seems to be the reality for the chiropractic market is the perception is anywhere from about 60 to 80% of your yearly collections, or more specifically, the average of the last 3 years of your collections, because even the market understands that the perception is looking backward and banks look backward. So we can do some easy math and you say, hey, the last year I averaged 400,000. The year before I averaged 380. The year before that I averaged 420. And the average of those 3 years is 400, right? Now you go, where does the 60 to 80% come in? Well, the perception is practices that are either larger and above average are going to command a larger percentage, and that would be the 80%. Practices that are smaller than average or in decline would go toward the 60%, and maybe 70% is ones that kind of are stable, steady, and land in the middle. Okay? So, again, this is not a hard and fast valuation formula, but you need to know the perception, because let's say your buyer perceives that somewhere along the line they learned this figure, 60, 80%, and you've got a great practice, and let's say your practice is doing, $600,000 a year, which is above average for chiropractic, and it's growing. And so in your mind, hey, we should be in the ballpark 600,000 times 80%. We shouldn't be in the ballpark of $480,000, $500,000, something like that, right? And if your buyer thinks that your practice should be $300,000, now you're way off. Or on the other hand, if you said, I asked, yeah, we're doing $600,000-700,000, and we asked like that other guy $1.2 million, your buyer's perception would be way off, and you don't get to have any more discussions because they'll think you're nuts. So it's very, very important to understand buyer perception. So just let's go through the math to make sure that you understand that. So if your most recent year was 225, the year before that was 300, 2 years prior was 375, your trend is going down, right? 3 years ago you did 375 in collections. This past year prior 300. Now the most recent year 225. We add that up. Your 3-year average is 300,000 times the 60% market perception factor. That might mean your practice is worth around 180,000. And don't worry, I'm going to show you the flaws with this formula here too. If we go the other direction, we take the exact same numbers, but now the practice is increasing. So 3 years ago, 225, then up to 300, then the most recent year is 375. It's the same $300,000 average. But on the increase, it's going to be used, or the perception is that it's going to be worth more, and we have a value of 240,000. Now, once you understand the market perception, you can, again, at least put yourself in the ballpark with a prospective buyer, but also you can now begin to appreciate the flaws. So just in that math here, there's several things that are left out. First of all, the first problem that we can immediately perceive is, what about the equipment? I mean, we have two $300,000 practices. One's got a table and a chair. The other's got a laser, a decompression, a digital x-ray, and everything. They both collected $300,000, but one's got way more equipment than the other, right? And then what about this? What happens to the AR? Well, again, if you take two equal practices and one's got a ton of AR, the other's got very little. We have a client who recently we were working with in helping him transition his practice. He's got a big PI practice. His PI accounts receivable were over $1 million. Well, a practice that's doing the exact same amount in collections and it has virtually nothing in AR is way different in value than a practice that's got over $1 million of AR sitting there, right? Well, also, the market perception doesn't take into account the bottom line. So just look at the picture here of these two offices. And the office on the left looks like a pretty generic chiropractic office. The office on the right looks maybe a little bit fancier, maybe a little bit more modern there. What if the office on the right was collecting $500,000 and had a 60% overhead? We can kind of do that math and say, oh, okay, so that chiropractor is, if 500,000 times 60%, that means about 300,000 goes to overhead, and the chiropractor might be netting 200,000 a year. And then we go over to the office on the left, and we go, wow, they're also collecting 500,000, but their overhead is only 30%. Now we go, whoa, there's a way big difference in what this chiropractor is netting. And so therefore, if we go to that formula that says 60-80% of 1 year's collections, the practice on the left is way more valuable, but the formula doesn't account for that. So all this to say, the fourth prerequisite that we absolutely need to understand about your practice value is there is no universal equation. And in many sense, when you discuss your practice value with a buyer, then you need to keep that in mind, because if they say, I heard this, it's likely that whatever they heard is either wrong or whatever they heard is only part of the story. The reality is that there are multiple ways to value a practice, and we're going to talk about those in a sec here. But just to kind of give you a real good, concrete, tangible, real-life example here, I want to talk to you about Dr. David. So Dr. David had a growing practice. He was collecting about $400,000 a year. He was making about $150,000 net from that practice, but he was ready to retire. So David contacted us and said, hey, I've got a real likable buyer. I mean, I like this guy. He's a nice young guy. He's really ambitious, and he wants to buy my practice. Now, I can tell you this, all of you will be flattered if and when the time comes, a buyer says, I love your practice, love what you're doing, love the location, love all the stuff about your baby. Because whether you realize it or not, this thing is your baby. And so David says, I think I got this great guy. I really like him. He wants to buy the practice. He's got $50,000 down. And I said, okay, so tell me about it. And he says, well, he kind of came up with this arrangement that he gives me $50,000 down, and he gets 25% of the profits for the next 3 years, and then we're done. He's bought me out. And he asked me, is this a good deal? Well, I'll ask you, and I'll actually give you the answer. No, I don't really think so. Obviously, everybody's situation is different. Maybe if David was absolutely desperate to get out, maybe he would take it. But he says he's kind of ready, but he wasn't desperate. And here's why. Even if we use the inaccurate ballpark formula and he's collecting $400,000 a year, his practice is growing, his practice might be up around $300,000 in terms of value. We also know that he nets $150,000. Okay, and so if we look at a $50,000 down payment and then 25% of the profits for the next 3 years, we go, let's just say the practice did the same, and we did that 25% of profits for the next 3 years, David would end up with the $50,000 down, 25% of profits for a total of $162,000. Now, on this conversation that I had with David, as I would have with any of you, I said, well, I haven't seen all your financials, so I don't really know the ins and outs. You told me what you gross, you told me what you net, but from the surface, no, I don't think you're getting a good deal. And so David said, that's kind of what I thought. So, that's why I want to hire you, the expert who can give me a hand here. And here's the deal we actually created. We said, well, first of all, do you even want to finance this whole thing? And I'm not 100% against owner financing, but I think in many cases it's unnecessary if you figure out and you understand the system and you understand how to get your buyers financed. So what we did for David was we got a bank loan for his buyer, which enabled David to get cashed out at 90%. In other words, 90% of his sale value. He ended up selling the practice for $345,000. He got 90% of that money right up front, and I'm not going to pretend to do the math on a webinar. And so his risk was now 10%, about $35,000. In the other way, he's got a huge risk that he even gets paid any of that money, and he only got a little bit of money down. Okay, so again, understanding even just a basic ballpark value will help you not do deals like this. So then we need to kind of dive a little deeper and we say, okay, so I kind of understand a little bit about the value. Now what kind of things do I need to know? And really, there are 4 additional questions that you need to dive deeper into to figure out what your practice is worth. And the first is kind of the, how, who, what, when kind of question. And really, it's how do you determine the price if it's not just one formula? How do we do this? Do we do it ourselves or how is it done? That kind of thing. Well, the how is really a big difference between an appraisal, an evaluation, and I guess we could just also say a guess, And an appraisal is considered a formal estimate of value. It's going to be written to IRS code specifications so that an appraisal not only will get you through a sale, if you have a death and there's an estate issue, a divorce, those kind of things, the IRS dictates the appraisal has to be done to these standards. And therefore, a formal appraisal is generally more expensive. A valuation is also going to get you to the end line, because what the appraisal says is the practice is worth this. The valuation is going to say, yes, here's an estimate of the value as well. So in the end, you do get a number. The evaluation is not necessarily need to be calculated according to IRS codes, because it's not going to be used in death or divorce proceedings. But if you're looking for the value of your practice, you don't really need that in most cases. So therefore, it's generally less expensive. And evaluation can even include a range of value where an appraisal has to hone in on one number. So that's the first in the way of how the value of your practice is determined. So the next is who does these things? Well, you can have several choices in terms of common sources: your accountant, an attorney, a bank, a broker, a consultant, or an independent, what they call a certified valuation analysis, or there are a lot of different initials, credentials that people might have. Those are people that commonly do valuations. But more importantly, you need to actually ask some questions of whomever would do your valuation, because you want a very accurate number for your purposes. So the very first question I always say is, do they have any experience with chiropractic practice sales or transitions? And herein, I'm going to pick on the accountants and maybe even the attorneys, and that a lot of them say, oh, yeah, we can value your practice. And an accountant is a numbers cruncher, and they've got formulas and everything like that, and that's great. The bad news is if they've never worked with chiropractors or they don't have a lot of chiropractic experience, they may be working off of formulas from other industries that they found, or just working off of generalized formulas on how to, profitably run a practice or a business, something like that. That's great, but they have no idea how that translates into chiropractic. So my suggestion would be to run from a person that doesn't have a chiropractic experience, and or let's say your buyer used their accountant to give a second opinion of what you asked for a price. The first thing I would do is say, how much chiropractic experience do they have? And, if any, right? The second would be, does this person offer transition help? So I'll pick on the attorneys. Attorneys are famous for saying, oh, yeah, we can help you with the contracts. Yeah, we can help, establish a value or anything like that. We worked with a client last year who had been going round and round and round with her attorney because of one simple misunderstanding. She thought the price for her valuation that the attorney did was going to include the contracts and the transition help. And really, the attorney did the first and the third, and the contracts, which is the end of the game and the beginning of the game, and the valuation didn't do any help in the middle. And what this client of ours very quickly realized is there's a long road between this is the price I'm asking and sign on the dotted line. And so it's very important to get not only a price, but the transition help to get you there. The other questions to ask are, well, what methods were used in the valuation? And this is kind of pointing the finger at all of you, because some of you will say, well, I heard the practice were worth this. This is how I priced it. That's a lousy method to use. And then lastly, you want to always consider the cost of the valuation or the appraisal. Okay, so let's kind of dive into some of the commonly accepted methods of valuation, because I want to give you some tools to be able to say, hey, how do we meaningfully take that price, or how do we maybe even refute a price that's been given to us, right? So there's something called adjusted book value, which is really a measure of tangible assets, and it's just adjusted to reflect fair market value. Something called the asset approach, which is basically assets minus liabilities. Would also include non-tangible assets such as goodwill or a non-compete, economic multiples. These are industry-specific rules of thumb. So a little bit like the market perception that we talked about, and there are other multiples that can be used inside of chiropractic. And of just this list, the asset approach is one of the favored approaches, not only by the IRS, but it usually applies to chiropractors, because we don't have typically a lot of tangible assets. So in that, you go, we don't have a ton of equipment, at least not compared to other businesses. The economic multiple can be very helpful because they are industry specific. I wouldn't do them alone. And then adjusted book value in many cases is not going to give us a very accurate value for our chiropractic practice, because again, we don't have much in the way of tangible assets, such as a company that's like manufacturing widgets, and they've got all these machines and equipment and everything, and basically all of their income is derived from these machines running well. Well, guess what? In chiropractic, you're the machine, and you're not a tangible asset. So if somebody were to say, hey, I did the adjusted book value on your practice and it's only worth this, and it's some pitiful number, well, now you know why. It's completely not appropriate for chiropractors. Okay, so then there's some more. You see, again, we mentioned before, there's not just one formula. Then we have what we call the income approach, which is measuring the active revenue producing power or the profitability of the business. We have what's called the investment value. Sometimes they also call this a going concern. This focuses on the value of a business as potential return on investment for the investor. In other words, hey, if I had to recreate this whole thing and buy all this stuff myself, what would it cost me and what kind of return could I get? Then we have what we call a liquidation value. This is kind of like the fire sale value. What's it worth for the equipment, files, no goodwill? And really, I hope that none of you ever use the liquidation value, but the income approach can be helpful. The investment value can be helpful to show your buyer, hey, what would you have to recreate here? And liquidation value, really, unless you are disabled, unable to practice, or unfortunately, if you're dead, I'm not talking to you, but your family, you're not going to get much on the liquidation value. Just add up the used equipment, and that's about it, right? So those are some other methods of appraisal, and we're still not done. And you can probably see now why this is a really tough do-it-yourself project. We also have what they call the market approach. This is the value of a business based on similar business sales. This is what they use in real estate. A lot of times they call it comps. Price to earnings ratio, which is a measure of a share price relative to per share earnings. Cash flow analysis, which is not a formal valuation method, but I'll talk to you about why we like this one best. Now, there are other formulas that are similar to the price to earnings. They have the EBITDA. They have all kinds of variations on these themes. But here's the reality. The market-based approach can be helpful to compare practice sales one to another, but it's also very limited because there's not a huge database like the real estate agents have with an MLS. There's no MLS for chiropractic practices, okay? So it's hard to compare, and there's a lot of differences comparing a practice in Alabama and Ohio, for example, okay? So then we have price to earnings ratio. Well, this is not really applicable because this is usually used for publicly traded companies, and most of the chiropractic practices aren't. So the last one that I would like to focus in on so that you can understand one of the most important factors in valuing your practice is what we call a cash flow analysis. Now, when we work with a client, this is our last method. This is kind of how we double check the price. And really, it's this. We kind of work everything backward. We said if we charge or we ask this for the price of the practice, and we went through and we can see what the practice would net in terms of profit or cash flow, and the bank loan to be able to buy that practice would be this amount of money, which requires this much monthly payment in terms of expense. Would it work? Would the bank be able to get paid? Would the buyer be able to make money? And preferably, would there be a margin for error for things to go wrong so that the bank can assure themselves they're going to get paid? And preferably, most preferably, would the buyer be able to not only pay themselves what they're getting now or a standard average prevailing wage, but would they do better than they're doing now? So in many ways, if you can reverse engineer all of this and say, look how this would work for you, Dr. Buyer, and look how this would work for you, the bank, to loan this buyer the money, then that is in many respects the most important valuation method because you're showing, hey, here's how things can work with our numbers and your numbers put together, okay? So the third thing to really understand about all of this is really when you value your practice. And in this, you need to consider your transition time frame, and you need to also understand that appraisals have an expiration date. So I was recently on a call with a doctor that said, yeah, 4 years ago, I got an appraisal that said the practice was worth this. Well, the hard news that I had to deliver immediately was that was 4 years ago. Your practice is probably not worth that now because appraisals are very time sensitive. So you do an appraisal or evaluation when you know you're ready to go down the road. And before that, well, I'm going to tell you what to do if you're further down and, if your transition's 5-10 years away. But again, it is important to understand that because real life banks look at the last 3 years of performance, and real life, you can come on situations where maybe things take an unexpected turn. That was what happened with Dr. Kathy, one of our clients. So she was collecting 670 in her practice, and there were 3 doctors, herself, her husband, and an associate. The husband got disabled, unable to practice, and he was doing 50% of the load. So Kathy came to us and said, here's my goal. I want to retire in a year because he is needing more care, and I want to be with him in his remaining years. We have a great associate, but like many associates, and maybe even your associate, she said, hey, this guy's got $150,000 of student loans. And basically, the way she acted it was there's no way he was getting financed. And so I asked a couple more deeper questions, and as it turns out, the associate had some money down, but the associate's big hangup wasn't the ability to get a loan. The associate had excellent credit. The associate even had saved away some money because the associate kind of thought that eventually he would want to be in his own practice, and his big fear was he had no management experience, which is why he never made the leap. And so what we did is say, hey, here's the deal. You can get into this practice. Dr. Kathy wants to kind of slow down and get out. She really doesn't want to sell right now because she actually needed some of the income, and the associate wasn't ready anyway. And so what we did was created a great deal for the associate, which was a slightly lower front-end price, but the willingness to keep Kathy on for the back end for some work so she can train him and transition him and she can continue to see patients. We like to call this the sell and switch because actually you sell the practice and then you work for the new owner as their associate. Well, here's the math and how this works out. She sold and she switched over a 7-month time period. We gave him 1 month free, and then she wound up working back for him. And this wound up getting her about $492,000, which is a good amount of money considering that half the practice went out the door when the husband stopped working. So really her practice value should have went in half. But because she was willing to stay on, and because her buyer needed that management transition to make him feel good, and because our contract that we wrote gave her bonus compensation based on the ability to keep the collections up, it worked out beautifully for everyone. And that's the other thing that you need to understand about the value of your practice is, in one sense, the numbers may dictate one thing, but the story's not done yet, is because you have to make those numbers meaningful. And in this respect, you have 4 time elements that really are going to enable you to do this well. If you want to sell at maximum value or get as much as you possibly can, and I don't know who wouldn't, you need to understand 4 very important elements that will play a factor in terms of time. And the first is supply and demand. Now, I've got good news for all of you on the webinar right now, because over the last few years, something has started changing. So if we wind the clock back as recently as 3 years, the numbers were really reversed, and we were suffering in terms of, from a seller point of view, from aging baby boomers wanting to get out and a all-time low in chiropractic school enrollment. Okay, this was a really bad situation. Now, what's happened is the ratios are starting to recover. In other words, we're seeing more chiropractors looking to buy practices and get in because the school enrollments are recovering. And I don't think any fewer baby boomers are trying to get out. I think there's still a ton of you in that area trying to get out, but there's just more buyers wanting to get in. And so we used to say it was like 10 to 1. In other words, 10 chiropractors wanting to get out for every 1 wanting to get in. And I can absolutely tell you this number is decreasing. And if I had to guesstimate it, we're actually crunching the numbers from a few years ago just to see where it is. But if I had to guesstimate, it's probably in half, which is really great news for you. The other thing, though, you need to understand is the spectrum changes over time too. And what we've seen is there are challenges at the two ends of the spectrum, meaning if you have a very small practice or a very large practice, those are still challenging to transition or to sell. Now, the other thing you need to understand about timing is the timing of financing. We entered in 2018 the historical event in several areas. One is historically low rate of the amount a buyer has to bring to the table. So in other words, you can now get people finance through the SBA, which is the primary loan backing program that probably is going to fund 90% of practice acquisitions. You can get these buyers financed in some cases with as little as 5% down. That's never happened. The loan interest rates are also very low right now, which those two combinations have created a loosening up factor by the lenders. They're more willing to lend, and therefore higher values may be easier to obtain. So where just a few years ago you might have had a buyer that's qualified for $200,000, $250,000, now they can qualify for $400,000, maybe even $500,000. Same practice, different lending, and different timing of your finances. The other thing you need to consider right now is something that I just, I'm going to step on some toes, but it's the millennial mindset. And a lot of people criticize the millennial mindset, and some of you have experienced that, but there's also a few things that go in your favor. The first is the millennials are coming out a ton in debt out of chiropractic school. Okay. In one way, this is a handicap, but in another way, they need the cash flow of an established business. And I think what's happening is fewer of the millennials are starting a practice from scratch because they simply don't have the money and they won't have the cash flow. And that translates well to purchasing a practice. The millennials are also, notorious for their instant gratification. So they want to purchase your practice and profit now. They don't want to start one from scratch and take 10 years to do it. Additionally, they have a bit of an entitlement syndrome, and they feel that they're doctors and they should be making a certain standard of living. They should be driving a certain type of car, and this makes them a little bit risk averse in terms of starting a practice from scratch or even taking an associate job that might pay them peanuts when they could buy a practice and instantly drive the car that they want. The other thing you need to understand about timing would be yours. And in fact, this is the biggest factor you've got going. There's something that I like to call the sell curve. And in this respect, your timing is the most important and most controllable factor that you have in terms of helping steer your practice to sell at a better time, which would get you more money. And the sell curve simply looks like this. Every practice starts the same in the struggle phase when you first open up or you first start out. Then you go through a phase of stability. Then you're going to hit your peak of success. And your peak may be different than other practices, might be higher. Maybe you hit 800,000. Maybe others are hitting 3 or 2, wherever it is. But eventually what happens is you hit what I call the slack phase. And the things you did to build the business, you're kind of getting a little tired or you slack off. And guess what? Your practice actually reflects that and starts to slide or go down a little bit. And then you hit what I call the slip phase, where you're actually getting negative momentum as the income is going lower and lower and lower. And this usually translates roughly into the amount of time you spend in practice. Now, just using common sense, if you were to sell, you would go, well, I want to sell in the success phase because that's when I'll get the most money, or maybe after it starts slipping a little, I'll sell. The reality is most of you will actually sell or look to sell in the slip phase. In fact, the numbers say 60% of you will do that, 20% will sell in the slack phase, and only 10% will do in the success phase. And those of you who can add really well will say, well, what's the other 10%? There are about 10% of chiropractors, for whatever reason, have a change of life, change of pace, and sell in the stability phase. But this tells me one important thing I would love to tell you. You need to sell or think about transitioning your practice a lot sooner than you probably normally would in order to get value, because once you hit that slip phase, your value is going downward, downward, downward quickly. And really, the two ends of the graph, we don't even really have much of a sale at all. Nobody wants to buy a practice in the struggle, and if it slips too far, guess what? You don't have a practice to sell. So in this respect, we had a client, Dr. Allen, who had a $700,000 practice. Great niche, steady collections, but he was completely burned out. In fact, when I talked to him on the phone, he said, man, if I got an offer, I'd leave right now. And I've done well. I own the building. I think I have options. I just don't know how to get out of here best or soonest, and what to do. And the reality of the situation is, he said, hey, help me get out of here. And here's what we arranged. We actually sold the practice for $500,000. He stayed on for a year, part-time work. We did the sell and switch, got another $100,000. He leased his building for $150,000. He got $750,000 up front, basically. And he said, done. Let's do that. Okay. And so in that, he really understood the sell curve in selling when the practice was doing well, and he really did well. Sold it for more than he ever could, total package. So in that, we want to dive into one more specific and talk about some factors, and we kind of call them intangible, other things that can affect your practice value, okay? And the first is your location. There are some hot spots in town, in the country, and these will make it easier to sell a practice. You'll get more applicants. If you're not in one of the hot spots, and here is a list of some hot markets, this doesn't mean you'll sell. It just means it takes you longer to find a prospective buyer, and you should consider that in the timing of your sale. The next is the performance of your practice is what sells, not potential. All of you will say, hey, I've got great potential. Everyone's got good potential. And in that respect, you need to understand that the performance of your practice is going in the right direction, can impact your pricing anywhere from 5 to 20% higher if you're going good. Thirdly, your transition options can greatly affect how much you take out of the sale. So for example, this will increase the number of prospects by anywhere from 25 to 200% more. In other words, if I put an ad out for you and say, hey, well, I want an associate with a possibility to own, you will get a ton of prospects. Okay. If I say, hey, I want a partnership, then you'll get fewer prospects. If I want to say a sale, you'll get a different number of prospects than, for example, an associate position. And if I say, hey, I want to pay you $120,000, you don't have to do any marketing, you don't have to do anything, you just show up and do your work and come home and collect your big fat check, you will get an absolute most amount of prospects, right? So the option you choose affects you, and it also affects the overall value. So I want to show you just kind of a little graph. Your partnership is kind of the most difficult and the least number of prospects. And as we go, you can kind of see, you go hybrid partnership, that's just unequal shares, traditional sale, sell and switch, and associate buyout, and a buy-in is just no money down. Okay, so as you go through your options, you can see that increases the number of prospects and even potentially the amount of money. And then the fourth and final is your flexibility. Really, how flexible you are will dictate how quickly you will transition. So if you say to me, hey, Tom, I need to get out for $1 million. I need to sell to a one-eyed, one-armed woman from Nebraska tomorrow because my lease is up next month, you're not very flexible. It's not likely to happen, and you're not likely to command your price. Now, with that, I'd love to kind of get you, in the last couple minutes we have, thinking about where you're going for your next step. And in fact, I want you to give yourself a little bit of a reality check and say, at this point, from what I know, am I prepared to go down this road or put plans in motion for figuring out what my practice value is really worth? So let me tell you this. If your transition is greater than 3 years away, you can prepare to sell your practice before it declines, but you don't really need a ballpark value or anything. You don't need a specific value right now because it won't be worth that later. If your transition is 0 to 3 years, then here's the reality. You're going to go ahead and get a value now. That would benefit you most now. You need to put your transition plans in value now. Whereas the guy 3 years away can just use that 68% ballpark figure and kind of keep moving. So with that, I'd love to offer you 2 ways to help you with your transition as we close. The first is, if you are in that prepare mode, meaning you're greater than 3 years out, and you just need to start getting your practice ready so you can sell at a peak time, then here's what I want to offer you. I want to offer you a free transitions checklist. I want to be able to offer you a discount on the ultimate exit strategy and be able to help you with preparing yourself for this practice. If that's you, type in prepare into the questions box and we will let you know how to get that. If you're on the put my plans in motion phase, which really means, hey, I need to go ahead and act soon because I want to sell my practice in the next 0 to 3 years, or I want to transition my practice in the next 0 to 3 years to slow down or get it to an associate, I want you to go ahead and sign up for a free, no obligation strategy session call with us. Just type in motion and we'll get you information on how to set up that free call. The other thing that you can do is go to one of these 2 areas on our website. Again, if you're looking to prepare and you want to get our free transitions or discounted offers, go ahead and type in prepare. And if you're ready to put your plans in motion, then go to /motion. And I want to send you that free strategy session invite. And I know we're out of time, and I appreciate all of you for sticking around. And I can turn this thing back over to Christy because I had so much fun. I think I lost track of time. So, Christy?
Thank you, Dr. Tom, and I certainly didn't mind you going over a minute or 2, and I know our audience didn't either. So again, type in prepare or motion, and we'll get that information to Dr. Tom and get that set up for you. Just a reminder, we will not have a webinar next week because it's the 4th of July holiday week. So I hope y'all all rest, relax, rejuvenate, enjoy your time off. We'll come back on July the 10th with Ms. Brandy Brimhall from KMC University talking about documenting and coding for unproven investigational or experimental procedures. You know, all those things listed in your provider agreements. So join us. We have a lot of great webinars and amazing speakers coming in July. Dr. David Jackson, Dr. Alan Sokoloff, Dr. Steve Conway, and Dr. Scott Munsterman. So go ahead, register now. Enjoy your holiday. Dr. Tom, thank you so much for being here today. We always appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to be a part of our webinar series.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Everyone have an amazing rest of your day, a fabulous week, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, everyone.